Good morning. I'd like to thank you for once again joining us here at the Greenbrier Church Online. This morning, I want us to take a look at two different books. The first book being A Man's Search for Meaning, written by Viktor Frankl. Mr. Frankl was an Austrian who was imprisoned in the German concentration camps during World War II. While he was imprisoned, he lost his wife, who was pregnant with their child, lost both of his parents, lost his brother, and eventually everyone he considered a friend would die. In the midst of all of that suffering, though, he survived. After his camp was liberated, he was released and he returned to his work in Vienna. Mr. Frankl wrote of those experiences in his concentration camp and the experiences of watching other prisoners who either survived or passed away. He concluded that the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche was right when he said, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how." Frankl saw that people who had hopes of being reunited with their loved ones, or who had projects that they needed to complete, or who had a great faith, tended to have a better chance of survival than the people who had lost all of their hope. The second book that I want us to look at this morning is the book of First Peter. We're in the middle of a wonderful study of this letter. I've shared with you that Peter's writing to people who are in the midst of suffering, in difficult times. And yet, instead of telling his listeners, just persist a little while longer and everything's going to be okay, Peter gives them a plan of action. Peter's intent is to share with his listeners why, so that they not only can bear the pain and the stress of their how, but they can bless their community in the midst of their how. So I want you to look with me at our part of the letter this morning. We want to hear Peter's words and see what they have to offer to those of us who are enduring the stress and the strain of the current struggle in which we find our world, our church, and our community. Peter says, "Therefore, rid yourself of all malice and all deceit, hypocrisy, envy, and slander of every kind. Like newborn babies, crave pure spiritual milk, so that by it you may grow up in your salvation. Now that you have tasted the Lord is good. As you come to him, the living stone rejected by men, but chosen by God and precious to him, you also, like living stones, are being built into a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, offering spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ." This morning, I want us to look at a few mustard seeds I got from Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, and I want us to see what Peter would have to say about those mustard seeds. The first one corresponds to verse 1. Love is the ultimate and highest goal to which a man can aspire. When I was younger, I had the opportunity to go to lots of gospel meetings, revivals, lectureships, workshops. I had the chance to hear a lot of the great gospel preachers from our brotherhood. I picked up a couple things sitting in those pews from listening to all of those sermons. And so what I'm about to tell you is not original with me in any way, shape, or form. It's just something that I used to hear a lot. And that thought is, whenever you read the phrase therefore, you need to go back and look and see what it's there for. It's kind of hokey, I know, but before we get into what Peter's saying this morning, we need to take a moment to back up and to see what he already said. We're spiritual beings living in a physical world, and oftentimes we forget what is the most important calling in our lives. We buy into the trappings of a broken world. We think that if we want to find real lasting happiness, if we want a little rest from our suffering, that's going to be found in the types of things that we can collect. Every one of us have struggled, or we're struggling right now with this temptation to make the highest goal in our life to merely fulfill these human cravings that we have. We make our personal happiness the ultimate goal. And in the end, we just add to our suffering. We decree that our personal wants and our desires are the most important things in our life, and we're left empty. As we gain professional success or become more popular or get a better car, house, job, larger bank account, we continue to struggle with this empty void in our lives. We continue to search and we continue to struggle trying to collect more stuff, only to continue struggling to find fulfillment and meaning in our lives? I mean, honestly, how much food, money, wealth, land, clout is it going to take for you to feel satisfied? How much pleasure? What level of success is enough? Peter's not downplaying our struggles or our suffering. Last week, we noticed that Peter was calling us to love one another actively with a love that is sincere, brotherly, earnest, and pure. Peter says your highest calling is to love. And we're only going to be able to find fulfillment, the fulfillment that our souls long for, when we love God above everything else and love our neighbor as ourselves. I think one of the reasons that we struggle, that we suffer so much here in this broken world is, well, we've forgotten our purpose. We've become so busy, our schedules overflow with so much that the end result is we forfeit our time with God. That's why our souls suffer. Our souls are suffering because they starve for the pure spiritual milk of Scripture. We've forgotten that our true purpose has nothing to do with how much money we make or how big of a house we live in or where we work or even what our profession is. God's purpose for our life centers around what type of person do you choose to be. Everything else in life flows from that. I mentioned last week here in our church when we were around the table that the best way for us to love other people is to do for them exactly what we would do for ourselves. We were all born with the desire for self-fulfillment. We all want to be happy. We want to find meaning in our days and friends that we can share life with. If we want our lives to have meaning, shouldn't we want that for other people as well? If you want to thrive in the midst of suffering, if you want to have a life worth living, you need to turn outward and you need to love your community. Peter's talking about caring about other people's needs and their highest goods. Every day you're going to run into people that are struggling, wondering, how am I going to make sense of what's going on in life and everything that's going on in this broken world? Everybody that you meet every day of your life is dealing with the same brokenness that we experience. Each and every one of them are in a desperate need to find someone that will show them love and compassion. When we try to find satisfaction in anything other than God, we'll never find that peace that our souls long for. Our highest calling is not to have a lot of money in the bank or to have the perfect family on social media, #BestLifeEver. Peter reminds us that love is the ultimate and highest goal to which we can aspire. And I think if we get love right, we can move to the next mustard seed, which is you have a choice about how you will respond in every situation. Continuing in verse 1, Peter says, rid yourself of all malice and deceit, hypocrisy, envy, and slander of every kind. I've been alive long enough to know that every discussion, every situation, there's a selfish way to respond and a loving way to respond. Unfortunately, we too often choose this selfish way to respond, and we just add suffering upon suffering. Many of us have bought into the lie that we can act or react in a certain way because of the things that happen outside that are happening to us. I mean, if somebody snaps at you, just go ahead and unload on them. Make sure you talk faster and louder than they do because nobody's going to talk to you that way. Maybe somebody takes credit for your work or complains about what you've done. They don't like the way that you do your hair or the clothes that you choose to wear. Maybe they criticize your children or your ability to parent your children. Every day you're presented with 100 opportunities to choose how are you going to respond. Peter says if we're going to be able to find the emotional space to make good choices, there are a couple things that we need to clear out of our lives. Particularly, there are 5 actions that are destructive. The word picture that he uses here is the idea of somebody taking off and discarding some soiled clothing. It's an allusion to how many early Christian converts would take off their old clothes before going into the water to get baptized and then coming out and putting on a brand new set of clothes. Peter says if we're actively loving one another with a love that is sincere, brotherly, earnest, and pure, there's some things that we're going to get rid of out of our lives, natural human reactions that we're going to clear out of our vocabulary. The first thing he says is we need to put away malice, which is this intent or desire to do evil. Malice is not an accidental sin. It's a sin on purpose with evil intent, or As Thomas Watson so eloquently wrote, malice is mental murder. When somebody wrongs you, our instinct is to get even or to cause them more pain than they caused me. Malice is the opposite of love. Peter says that we also need to put away deceit. There's this old adage that hurting people are the ones that hurt other people. The first way that we hurt people is through deception. We actually live in a time where people are infinitely more shocked by honesty than deceit. And yet deceiving somebody is one of the most basic violations of a person's rights. Deceptions and lies shatter the reality of other people, and eventually it erodes their ability to believe that they can be loved and valued. Peter says we need to put away hypocrisy. We're hypocrites when we claim to have moral standards or beliefs that don't match up to the way that we live. A hypocrite is that hothead who tells you, just calm down, just calm down. Or the person that's always lying who accuses you of lying. Hypocrisy goes hand in hand with making judgments about other people's actions or motives or reasoning. You see, when we're hurt, it becomes all too easy for us to take a position of superiority and to judge people that don't live up to the standard that, well, we're not able to live up to. Peter says, put away envy. It's a selfish and ugly spirit. In your suffering, you look at what somebody else has and you think about what they have and you think, they don't deserve that. I deserve it. They don't need that. I should have that, not them. I mean, that's why social media is so destructive. We've edited out the worst parts of our humanity, and we put pictures and stories on Facebook and Instagram that aren't real. Stories that just create envy, which often leads to slander or saying something false or maybe just kind of true. And we say those things for the purpose of damaging someone else's reputation. We slander people when we say things that are intended to hurt them, to hurt their reputation. Peter says if we're going to make the choice to live out our love, the very first thing we have to do is put away these things. These 5 actions make it very difficult for us to love. Peter wants us to have the space to choose to live out our love. And I know that's difficult to do when we live in the middle of so many people that are walking disasters. So maybe we just need to let the Apostle Paul help us here a little bit. Paul writes to the church in Rome that they need to hate what is evil and cling to what is good. Think back to the last time you experienced a conflict with someone. In that moment, was it easier for you to cling to what the person did or said that was offensive to you? Or was it easier to cling and to think about what's good about them, what's right about them? Peter knows it's easier to demand our rights, to demand justice. And in those moments, we cause just as much conflict as we experience. So many of us make the choice to cling to what is evil and to hate what is good. But every interaction that you have, you're given the opportunity to choose how are you going to react to that situation. To love without malice, deceit, hypocrisy, envy, or slander. To do that, we have to make the choice to cling to what is good. When somebody causes conflict, when they're hypercritical, you get to decide how you're going to respond. You can listen to what they say, and if it's true, fix what needs to be fixed. You listen to what they say, and if it's just an opinion, you can choose if you want to change it or not. And if it's a lie, you can choose to just ignore it. For example, if somebody approached me and began to talk about my daughter and how mean she is and how she gossips and tells lies, and they rail on and on about how inappropriately she's dressed and how she acts trashy around those boys, I can get really, really defensive. Or I can just ignore them because I don't have a daughter. But if we're going to make love our priority, we have to clear out the space to make a choice that brings honor to God, because nobody can take away your freedom to choose your response. As we make our way to the table this morning, I want to leave you with one final mustard seed, and that is suffering ceases to become suffering at the moment it finds meaning. That's verse 5. You also, like living stones, are being built into a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, offering spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. Peter's already written that our faith is perfected through our suffering. It's going to result in us becoming more like Christ. Being a child of God doesn't take away our suffering. Actually, it's important in the process of making us more like Jesus. Peter's metaphor about being a living stone is about being set aside for a specific project. God is currently building us into a spiritual house, a dwelling place for himself. God's no longer just going to reside in the Holy of Holies in the temple in Jerusalem. God resides in the spiritual house that is made up of living stones that are scattered all over the world. In this new temple, God not only finds a place to dwell, he finds room to fulfill his purpose. Do you know what your purpose is as a Christian? Do you want to find the purpose and meaning in your suffering? Jesus tells us our purpose when he summarizes the law and the prophets in 2 sentences. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, body, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. If that's a little long for you, in John's gospel, Jesus summarizes even that down to 1 sentence when he says, love one another as I've loved you. Your purpose in life is to worship and to serve God. Your purpose is to be the hands and the feet of God in a broken world, to live out your faith in such a way that people will want to come and know your Heavenly Father. We all struggle with the desire to conform to the world, but when we go back to the table, we're reminded that we have been called to be holy, to be God's representative in our own little part of this world. It's a call that reminds us that even in times of pain and suffering, we can live differently than the people in our community because we know we are saved through the loving sacrifice of God. As we take the emblems this morning, we're reminded of the suffering of Christ. The emblems take our mind back to the cross and to the words of our Savior in Luke's gospel. Jesus says, if anyone would come after me, he must deny himself, take up his cross daily and follow me. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for me will save it. The call to take up our cross is a call to die. When a man carried a cross, he was already condemned to death. Jesus says, in order to follow him, we must be willing to die. That's not necessarily a martyr's death or a call to be imprisoned or beaten or tortured for our faith. Rather, it's a call to death, much like Paul experienced when he proclaimed, I'm crucified with Christ, nevertheless I live. Yet not I, but Christ lives in me, and the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith of the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. The meaning of our suffering is found when we die to our own way of doing things. We consider our will, our rights, our passions, our goals to be crucified on that cross with Jesus. We forfeit our right to direct our own lives and give that right of direction to God, who's going to do a much better job than we will anyway. So as we take the emblems this morning, we have to figure out, have we found peace in the midst of our suffering that comes from taking up our cross? You see, I believe that Peter's telling us the truth. He's not downplaying the reality of our suffering, but he's saying that not only can we survive, we can thrive in the midst of our suffering as long as we are reminded that we suffer to be like Christ. And at the moment that this suffering is over, we will get to be with Christ. I hope you have a wonderful time around the table this morning. Please always remember that you are loved deeply. Go in peace. I look forward to talking to you very soon.